So I first want to acknowledge that this is joint first work with Michelle Perdomo, with whom I would have presented today if it was logistically possible. But also that this is, again, joint collaboration with Tessa at UPIT and Ariel James at McAllister. So I'd like to start by introducing two syntactic manipulations that are used as test beds for studying the mechanism that underlies syntactic processing during reading. So the first are extracted relative clauses, where sentences that have relative clauses where the subject of the sentence is also the doer of the relative clause is found on average as easier than sentences where the subject of the sentence is the object of the relative clause in reaction times, accuracies, and fixation durations. And the second manipulation is the use of verb bias information to elicit garden path processing, where given temporarily ambiguous sentences such as these that contain verbs that are biased towards subjective complement interpretation, such as admitted, they're easier to process when people encounter the disambiguating region than when you encounter sentences where the verb is biased towards a direct object interpretation, such as discovered. And so there are two general classes of accounts that try to explain the difference in behavior from processing sentences with RCs and sentences with these verb bias manipulations. The first is what I term resource-based accounts. So these accounts stipulate that the processing difficulty in the harder sentences is brought about by constraints and limitations in cognitive processing of the linguistic input. So theories like dependency locality theory, cue-based retrieval fall under this general account. And the second account is a general account is experience-based accounts, where the processing difficulty is brought about by violations of expectations about linguistic input based on experience and the implicit knowledge of the statistical distribution of forms in the language. And so to the extent that these accounts are correct, these accounts make implications about how people should differ in processing the manipulations that I talked about earlier. That is, if the research-based account is correct, an implication is that differences in domains like attention control, general working memory, short-term memory, or processing speed, which are domains that are related to resources, should regulate the processing of input that would predict differences in syntactic processing. Whereas in experience-based accounts, it predicts that differences in language experience or vocabulary and word knowledge or just general knowledge of language should predict differences in syntactic processing. And so in some, these accounts stipulate that systematic differences in these domains should be associated with systematic differences in syntactic processing. Now, there is a rich amount of work that have sought to implicate these individual differences, some of them cited here, in individual cognitive abilities and language experience to explain these individual differences, but the results of those studies have been mixed, providing either support for the presence of these individual differences or the lack thereof. But the interpretation of these mixed effects is complicated by the fact that historically a lot of the individual differences studies have been done in what we term psychometrically precarious conditions. And what we mean by that is that usually people just measure one measure per construct or just one construct. So in this case, one working memory task and one syntactic effect. And in the presence of those two things, your results really depend on the reliability of either the individual difference task or the syntactic manipulation. And if one of them is unreliable, then you'd be hard-pressed to find a relationship between the two of them. And a second precarious condition is that these studies are usually done under what we call small sample conditions. That is, the samples usually have few subjects, and because the target of inference in these studies are interaction effects, there are usually too few subjects to detect interaction effects consistently. And second, there are usually too few items per condition, so it's hard to measure each person's syntactic effect reliably. And it's well known in classical test theory that when you have a test, the more items you have in the test, the better ability you have in measuring that person's score reliably. So in an experiment, the more items you have, the more reliable you have, the more probable you are to detect the syntactic effect more reliably. And so in keeping these psychometric limitations in mind, James et al. Collected what was then much more data than usual for psycholinguistic studies of individual differences to improve on some of those conditions that I talked about earlier. And so they collected 117 participants, collected 5 constructs and 2 to 3 tasks per construct, where they found an overall relative clause and verb bias effects. But what they did not find are systematic individual differences in the relative clause and verb bias effects. That is, they did not find interactions between the composite ID scores that they collected and the relative clause and verb bias effects. And so at the end of the study, they raised a couple of issues for why they did not, possibly did not find those individual differences. So one issue they cited is that the sample they collected may be too homogeneous. That is, 90% of their sample was from the university population. And this may have resulted in limited variability in the relative clause and verb bias effects. So that even if we had so much variability in the cognitive abilities or language experience, if there were no differences in the relative clause or verb bias effects, then there's nothing to modulate. The second issue is that the estimates of the relative clause and verb bias effects per person were not reliable, and they observed that calculating split halves reliability. So in the current study, we sought to improve on some of these conditions. So the goals of the current study to address issue 1 is to obtain a more diverse sample. That is, we hope that by obtaining a more diverse sample, we get more variability in the relative clause and verb bias effects. To address issue 2, we hope to obtain more reliable estimates of the relative clause and verb bias effects by changing some aspects of the study design. And assuming that we addressed both issues 1 and 2, we then want to see whether the individual differences in cognitive ability and language experience would modulate the relative clause and verb bias effects. So in the current study, we recruited participants from the general Nashville community using flyers, social media ads. We went to libraries or word of mouth. We invited them from studies that they participated in previously in our lab. The study was run over 2 days in person, and we decided to run it in person to have better overhead over data quality. And so the minimum amount of time that participants took to participate in this study is about 2.5 hours. And the first day, they did a moving window self-paced reading for both the relative clause and verb bias manipulations, and they also completed a reading habits and demographic survey. On the second day, they completed various individual difference measures, most of which have been collected in James et al. And so to review those constructs, we measured attention control using the Stroop, flanker, and antisaccade task. We measured working memory using the reading span, operation span, and listening span task. We measured short-term memory using the backward and forward digit span, processing speed using letter and pattern comparison, phonological awareness, which is the knowledge and application of how sounds of English go together using a task where they blend non-words, where they reverse the phonemes of a non-word to create a word, and to repeat pseudo-words that are phonologically complex. And we also measured language experience and skills using the author recognition task, pronouncing irregular words, a vocabulary task. We asked them to estimate how much time they're reading, and we also asked them to compare themselves on how they read relative to their peers. And so a quick comparison of James et al. And the current study. So the things highlighted in blue are the aspects in which our study is different from James et al. So we've collected more participants, and this study is still ongoing. Our target sample size is above 300, and we're reaching that point. The study has been going on for 2+ years now. Our participants are older, they're also wider in age, and we also added more items per condition in the relative clause manipulation. But our study is similar in terms of educational attainment and racial and ethnic background to James et al. And so as a reminder of the goals, these are what we had. And so to give you answers to goals 1 and 2, we present you descriptives of the variability in the syntactic effect estimates, just to give some evidence that there is some variability in those effects and the individual differences. And then importantly, that whether these syntactic effects are reliable indicators of a person's syntactic processing and the reliability of the individual difference scores themselves. And so looking at variability, to orient you to this graph, the x-axis is the observed effect size for the reaction times. We have a couple of effects here, the RC effect at the relative clause region, the RC effect at the prepositional phrase, and the verb bias effects. So the takeaway here is that there is substantial variability in the observed effect size across these three effects, where there's at least a standard deviation of about 117 70 to 117 milliseconds. And so when we look at the variability in the ID scores, we see that they're similar or greater than the ones that are observed in James et al. So this graph on the x-axis is the possible scores that you could obtain for each of these tasks. In blue are data from James et al. From the paper, and the black is our current study. And as you can see, the dots or the point range plots look either the same or that our ranges are a little bit wider. And so now that we've established that there is variability in the slopes and the individual difference scores, we want to ascertain whether the syntactic effects are reliable and the individual difference scores are reliable. And so what I'm reporting here are the reliability estimates obtained from James et al. What we computed is split half reliabilities and test retest reliabilities when applicable. So 86 of these participants came back to the lab to do a different study, and in that different study we obtained some of the measures that we obtained in this study. And the test retest median gap between their participation is about 21 days, so we hope that there were some practice effects lingering there. And so we see that by increasing the amount of items in the relative clause, we improved on the reliability of the RC effect estimates with the increased items, but we're still not at the target levels of 0.8 that's usually accepted in the literature. When we look at the verb bias effects are still horrible. They still have poor reliability, so they're not good indicators of people's syntactic processing. And when we look at the individual difference measures, most of them are fairly reliable, so that's good news for us if you're using some of these measures, but if you're using the attention control measures, you're in bad luck. So using Stroop, Flanker, in this case, the ones that we're able to measure our reliabilities for, they're not great measures of attention control. And so now that we've sort of gotten evidence for one, and we sort of gotten evidence for goal 2, where we both see variability and we sort of see reliability, we now ask whether there are individual differences modulating these RC and verb bias effects. And so to answer that, we fit statistical models. I am presenting 2 sets of models today. One are base models that are just looking at the overall relative clause and verb bias effects. And the second are models where we look at whether the individual difference factors are modulating the syntactic effects. And the way that we computed the individual difference composite scores here is that each measure was z-scored, and z-scored were averaged for construct. And the reason why we did this is that not all of the participants had a complete set of scores, because some had to be excluded because of ineligible behavior, and latent variable analysis, which we hope to do in the future, does list-wise deletion. And so if we did that, we'll be down to like 80 participants who had a complete data set. So we hope to do the latent variable analysis in the future. So when we look at the base models, here's the RC effect. We see the canonical effect between the ORCs and the SRCs, where the ORCs are harder in both the relative clause and the prepositional phrase. On the x-axis are the regions, and on the y-axis are the model estimates. When we look at accuracy, we see on the x-axis are the RC types, and the accuracy for the ORCs are lower, and it's especially lower for questions that are targeting the relative clause. So the summary here is that we see the standard RC effect. When we look at the verb bias effect, we see that there are longer RTs for the ambiguous sentences at the disambiguating modal verb, but there is no interaction between the bias of the verbs. So regardless of whether participants encountered an SC or DO biased verb, the ambiguous condition was just generally harder. And there were no differences in the accuracy for the comprehension questions as well. And so for the money shot, looking at the individual differences, modulating the RCFX. So on the x-axis here are the composite scores that we computed. Each panel represents an individual difference construct that could potentially modulate the effect. And on the y-axis is the size of the RC effect per participant. So each dot here is a participant effect size. And as you can see, these lines are flat. Individual differences do not, the measures do not modulate the RC effect that we see, and we see that in both the relative clause and the prepositional phrase. When we look at the verb bias effects, the same story is found where the lines are flat. It's the same graph as before, only what's plotted on the y-axis here is now the verb bias effect. So in the same way as the first set of results, individual differences do not modulate the verb bias effect as well. And so to recap, what we found is one, that the larger and more age-diverse sample produced substantial variability in the observed RC and verb bias effects. Second, that we observed improved reliability for the RC effect estimates by increasing the number of items, but still unsatisfactory technically for a reliable measure of people's syntactic processing. We hope that by achieving our target sample size, we'll get at that better because we did an a priori sensitivity analysis that told us that 300 participants would get us to that level, but time will tell. But the reliability of the verb bias effects remain poor. And so conditioning on 1 and 2, we found that individual differences in the cognitive ability and language experience are not modulating the RC and verb bias effects. So a couple of considerations to think about here. Our current sample is only diverse in age, and we acknowledge that. And one may argue that if we diversify in other respects, we might see the interactions. And I am happy, or maybe sad to tell you, that we've been at this for 2+ years, trying to make connections to diversify our sample in other respects. But we get complaints that such as the study is long. We initiate conversations with community members, but higher-ups don't approve of the protocol. It's difficult to get people to drive out to sites. Our tasks are so boring. And so there are current efforts. So we're attempting to recruit participants with no college experience to Research Match, which is a program that allows, so it's usually used in the medical community to recruit people from special populations. We're trying to connect people with people with YMCA in Nashville, and we're also exploring gamifying some of the tasks and self-paced reading to make this more fun and that participants don't think like they're dying when they're participating in our studies. And so on a more general note, these actions highlight that individual differences research require additional considerations beyond those used in typical experimental work. And what we often see is that people co-opt experimental designs to study individual differences. But when you do individual differences work, you need bigger and more diverse samples for both subjects and items than is typical for experimental work to detect more reliable effect estimates and to have greater power to detect interactions. And so this requires a thinking through hard things. So about balancing logistic constraints to improve psychometric constraints. So you need to balance having more trials versus considering that your participants might get tired, recruiting more participants when your participants are hard to recruit, or taking time to improve the measures, or versus hoping that the ones that you currently have are good enough. And I don't have a solution for this. This is probably something that you have to contend with on a case-by-case basis, but these are considerations that have to be thought about when studying individual differences. And so on that last point of taking time to improve the measures versus hoping for the best, for the RC and verb bias effect specifically, we're finding that because these are different scores, and different scores are notoriously unreliable. Another example of different scores that people in a different subfield have found to be unreliable are Stroop and flanker tasks, and as we've shown here, they are as well. And they're projected to require hundreds to thousands of trials per condition to achieve target reliable levels. Now, based on our a priori sensitivity analysis, it seems to be the case that it's not that prohibitive for psycholinguistics, but maybe this is a fundamental limitation of experimental effects when people seek to use them as individual difference measures. And so maybe a way forward is exploring language processing outcomes that are more reliable. So one solace that we found is in attachment preferences. So apparently people are very reliable if they're low attachers or high attachers for ambiguous relative clauses, so that's great. And maybe we can answer some of our individual differences questions with those more reliable measures. And so with that, I end, and I look forward to questions if you have any. Thank you.
Hello, I'm James In from Mississippi State University. Definitely interesting stuff. I agree that there's not enough individual differences overlaps with language research in the past, especially not with such extensive sample sizes. I can say that I'm definitely not surprised that the attentional control measures performed so poorly. There's definitely been a lot of issues throughout the individual differences research, especially with reviews by like Randy Engel, some people very prominent in the field, who have determined that a lot of these attentional control and inhibition measures, which are very popular, have that very poor reliability. Also, upon my own inspection of the literature as well, it seems like a large problem for our field especially is trying to find these reliable measures for language processing in particular. Like, around 0.6 reliability isn't terrible per se. It's definitely not what you want. And like you said, trying to gather 300 participants with extensive backgrounds, it's taken you 2 years. And so if anyone else is asking these questions, it'd be very long projects. So I suppose what I'm interested in is hearing more about your ideas of potential different tasks that could potentially move toward a more reliable language processing framework so we could see more of these language effects and associate them with further individual differences.
So I'm not sure about tasks. There is some exploration of using different items to maybe elicit more reliable individual differences. But I think it's less about the items and more about how those measures are computed. If you're computing different scores, you're just very hard-pressed to compute reliable measures for that. So even if you look at different items, if essentially you're still computing different scores, you're bound to find that, I think. But maybe, like I mentioned, if you're looking at something that doesn't involve different scores, like the attachment preferences ones, where you don't need to compute a subtraction, you might get more promise there. And maybe that needs a reframing of a little bit of questions about what we consider systematic individual differences in language processing. But in terms of tasks specifically, we have a couple of reading tasks: eye tracking, maze, self-paced reading. There's one that's proposed like mouse tracking. And so those are your 4 options. And I don't know if they've been tested enough to detect reliable individual differences.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Van.
Hi, Peter.
Nice talk. Peter Gordon,
Thank you.
University of North Carolina. Could you put up one of your scatter plots of like your object RC, subject RC difference, just related to the scores? And I don't remember whether it was a composite measure. No, this is an observed measure of object RT minus subject RT, and that's presumably by participants.
That is correct.
And so what strikes me about this, and I've seen it in my own data, is that there are people with negative scores. Mm-hmm. And that is very hard to imagine any kind of framework of language processing in which a subject RC is harder than an object RC.
Right.
And so that, to me, just speaks to the amount of variability we get with these different scores. And that, it would seem to me that you'd have to say, not only does your sample size in terms of population have to get, or the population you sample have to get larger, but you'd have to assume that those dots below 0 essentially reflect error. And so if you drive, you'd have to get a large enough sample per subject with stimuli to like get those much closer to zero to
If
have
we're
any-
assuming that the true effects are all positive, yes.
well, that's what I said. I mean, the reason the object-subject difference has been of interest in psycholinguistics is that there are a lot of explanations about why it might occur. I've never heard an explanation of why a subject RC might be harder than an object
Well,
RC.
the explanations are targeted towards average differences,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
These are, and that's the average collapse across all participants.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's the explanations don't consider the possibility that there are negative scores contributing to that average. And so it's a challenge for accounts, therefore, to explain why those scores are negative, because I think it's very difficult to imagine that just by increasing the number of items that all of these participants would then end up being above zero.
Yeah, well, I don't actually believe that necessarily, but I believe you might run into task constraints where people just get so used to the task that they stop exhibiting more typical behavior. But, again, you'd have to, it's generally within this kind of framework considered that this is a measure of difficulty from 0 and above, not negative infinity to
I don't
positive
know, maybe some
infinity.
participants find that overseas are harder, and now you have to explain that. I don't know.
I'm just basically agreeing with the conclusions that
Right,
you've
right.
offered, that this
Yeah.
is maybe a fool's errand.
Hey, Van. Long time no see. I wanted to actually shift gears and think about how some of these variables may actually be related. So one of the things that you mentioned, which became pretty obvious, is that age seems to be the most diverse factor that you have going on for you. And age also tends to correlate highly with some of these measures that you're seeing. So things with attentional control and processing speed, short-term memory. Like you could see age-related effects in some of these measures. And so I'm wondering why not maybe treat age as covariate, maybe see whether or not some of these differences could be better accounted for something like aging and the kinds of things that come naturally with aging, as opposed to treating all of these as like individual measures or clumping them necessarily all together. So that last point is like, I don't necessarily know if I think the same kinds of mechanisms are biased between a flanker task and a street task, for example. So I don't know if you have thoughts.
I don't know. I guess the question there is whether you think it's age. Age is the causal factor that causes the modulation in the syntactic effects, or the cognitive factors are.
Well, it's more of maybe there is something related between, let's say, attention and phonological awareness, or maybe attention and one of the language skills just given by age and how there might be an inverse relationship, for example.
So yes, it's interesting that you see that, because in our current study, we see this positive manifold of correlations across the tasks that we did not observe in James et al. So there's a lot of positive, like significant correlations, but I guess significant because the sample size is high, across multiple measures that are supposed to be measuring distinct constructs. So I don't know if it gets to the heart of your question, but there seems to be a relationship there that might be explained by age, and so we haven't entered age as a covariate in the construct is the short answer, but yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, Jessica Montag, University of Illinois.
Hi.
So I love this. This is great, and I really appreciate how you're being so rigorous about all the psychometric issues there are with individual differences work. So one, I have a comment and a commiseration that your sample seems to be the variability is coming from having older participants, particularly in like higher reading. And so any learning theory is really going to predict less individual variability among expertise. So like the difference between an expert and a super expert ought to yield a smaller difference in behavior, right, than a novice and an expert with sort of an asymptoting effect. And so you're kind of running into this problem where you're getting a more diverse sample, but diversity among individuals who you think ought to be more similar in behavior. So I encourage you to keep going with this work to try to recruit other kinds of variability. I think that's going to be really crucial for answering your research questions because of this nonlinearity in your age and experience effects.
So our response, I guess, is that in terms of the distribution of, let's just take age as
Yeah.
an example, right? I think our distribution is positively skewed, so it's not as if we have a lot of older participants.
Oh, yeah.
So in terms of that exponential curve, I don't think we've reached the plateau yet of where there might
Yeah,
be.
you're just going to see diminishing returns
Right.
as you get variability in that direction.
Yeah, and we do see that there's a lot of variability in the RC and verb bias effects, and so we don't see that there's still there's still variability. So asymptote doesn't seem to be happening
Okay,
right now.
that's
But
great to know.
thanks.
Yeah,
Tessa.
and this is great. Keep going.
Thank you.
So sorry. Thanks so much for all of the very engaging conversations. Continue them during lunch, please. And let's thank Van once again for the presentation.